At 3:30 p.m. on Tuesday, February 24th, a large section of pavement collapsed on Pacific Street just to the east of its intersection with 67th Street or Elmwood Park Road. Two stopped passenger vehicles fell into the collapsed area with the pavement. The City of Omaha Police, Fire, and Public Works personnel immediately dispatched to the scene to assist motorists and to assess the damage. A large void was observed under the pavement. It spans from approximately the northern edge of the sidewalk on the north side of Pacific, and it goes down to about the northern boundary of the southernmost eastbound lane. That's about 50 feet wide. In addition, it spans from approximately the stop bar at the intersection to about 30 feet to the east, so we're looking at a void that's about 30 feet by 50 feet. The depth is in the range of 10 to 15 feet deep, just depending on where it's at. So very, very large void that opened up at the location. An MUD water main within the collapsed area was observed to be broken and running water at the time of the collapse. Water flowing from the main was observed entering an existing storm sewer, which is approximately 10 feet in diameter. At the location, city personnel were on site with dye. They placed dye into the cavity with the water. The dye was observed running about 1,800 feet to the west into the Little Papillion Creek. An OPPD duct bank was also damaged in the collapse. I don't believe there was an outage, but there is some damage to the duct bank. Based on the size and condition of the void, it's evident that a pressurized water source has been scouring soil from beneath the pavement and into the storm sewer for some time. City personnel and MUD are continuing to investigate the cause of the collapse and to coordinate all of the repairs in the area. City of Omaha rights-of-way have many utilities in them. These utilities are allowed to operate by an agreement between the city and the owners of the utilities. It's vital to these agreements that all parties properly maintain and are accountable for their infrastructure. MUD has been asked to provide a timeline for the repairs to the water main. Coordination is also occurring with OPPD for the scale and timeline of their repairs. And finally, citizens should not be concerned to travel on Omaha streets. We believe this to be an isolated incident caused by an unusual set of circumstances that are truly isolated to this particular location. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
How far, because I was out there earlier, I saw underneath the void, there's one big, the black pipe, which I think the truck was basically sitting on. And then I saw the bank of wires, which I saw some CenturyLink, people out, which, which I'm guessing that's what you're talking about, that has to be replaced. What is that? What was the other pipe that was there?
My understanding is that MUD has two water mains that go through the area. One of them was intact. The other one had water flowing from it. There's a steel, the duct bank for the OPPD infrastructure is steel, looks like a steel beam in the hole. And to your point, there are a number of other communication utilities that are in conduit that are running throughout the area as well. Some other smaller pipes and those kinds of things, but pretty typical city right-of-way with utilities in it.
Is there gas nearby?
I'm not sure where the gas line is. I didn't observe a gas line. I'm not aware of any problem with any gas lines, but that's certainly something that we'll be making sure that we coordinate with MUD.
How far down was that, the water main break?
The water main depth was relatively shallow in the hole. From what I observed, roughly 4 to 6 feet deep.
Okay. How long do you think it was leaking? Do you have a guess?
I don't have a good guess on that. I think we're trying to find some stream flow data from the creek to see if we can figure out about how long that was leaking, but it appeared to me that there had been pressurized water flowing in the cavity for some time before.
How big was the main that broke?
I don't know the exact size.
So you believe the water main break led to the sinkhole as opposed to MUD says the collapsing of the concrete is what caused the water main break? That's what we're hearing from them.
I think that based on the size of the void and the condition of the edges on the void that were wet, they appeared to be fairly cleanly scoured. it appeared evident to me that a pressurized water source would be required to erode the sides of the void the way they were.
Austin, I know you said this is an isolated incident. I think the biggest thing right now is the fear that people will have just sitting at a simple stoplight that it could happen to anybody. How can you reassure the public that this is just an isolated incident?
Yeah, we have a lot of roads in the city and a lot of utilities out there. I know our utility partners do a really good job of maintaining their infrastructure. We have a lot of instances where if we see a ground settlement start coming up, we make sure to investigate those relatively quickly. It's fairly unusual for anything to open up that manifests at the surface, because usually we have some indication beforehand of some settlement that occurs that gives us a good indication there might be a problem there for us to investigate. So we just continue to investigate those and continue to make sure that, and listen to our citizens as well, to make sure that anything that gets reported gets fully investigated.
In recent time, how many sinkholes have there been in Omaha, and are you guys able to kind of grasp a trending theme as to why these are happening by chance?
I really don't have an exact number. I could pull that information because we certainly track every one of them. It is a fairly common occurrence, more common than we would like. I can tell you that every single one of them is caused by erosion of some sort. And there's a number of different sources for that erosion. It could be a pressurized water source. It could be water infiltration. It could be a problem with a sewer line, those kinds of things. So that there's a number of different causes, but ultimately it comes down to erosion, because all pavement, as you know, it's not designed to be a bridge. It's not built to stand on its own. It has to have the support from the soil underneath it. And when we lose that soil support, we're obviously susceptible to some kind of a collapse.
And forgive me if you touched on this earlier, how many people were out of water in that area just for that time?
That I don't know.
Is there any sort of preventative maintenance that can be done to prevent sinkholes from happening, just ahead of time?
Yeah, again, there's a number of different causes for why that happens. I think with some recent changes to our design specifications and those kinds of things, we've gone to a situation where we have some less erodible soils with some different base underneath our pavements. So we're from a design standpoint trying to head that off as we move forward. But obviously, anytime that we have instances where water can find its way under pavement or is already under pavement, those areas are the most susceptible. So monitoring those outfall locations, looking at stream data, looking at any kind of settlement that occurs, those are the best practices that we have currently.
How come this one didn't have any warning signs that the water was building up under the street until it collapsed?
I think one of the biggest reasons why, usually we'll manifest some surface water, right? And so I think one of the biggest reasons for this was the presence of that approximate 10-foot storm sewer underneath, which, the storm sewers are not 100% watertight in any event. And so I think that there was just enough capacity for that storm sewer to take the water that was coming from the water main, that nothing came to the surface.
Are there going to be any changes to how this policy happens going forward? Because I'm sure there are other streets that have the sewers underneath where the water could be hiding, and same thing could happen.
Yeah, it's certainly something we've looked for. There's evolving technologies in this field too. I'm not sure that we have any at this point that are employable, that we know work and can give us the best accurate information, but there are evolving technologies in the area of subsurface investigation, and so we're continuing to evaluate those, and if we can find something that we think will provide us good information, we would certainly go that route.
Did the recent snow melt play any role in the amount of water that was under this sinkhole or in this sinkhole?
I don't believe so. We don't tend to see, we don't tend to see large runoff rates with snow melt like with heavier rainfalls. Snow melts slowly, more gradual. It's a more metered runoff, so it's not kind of the gushing water that we would see from a heavy July thunderstorm, something like that. But so I don't believe snow melt played a factor in this.
I know you say you're working on a timeline with MUD. If that isn't available at this moment, do you have an estimate of when that could be?
It hinges on a number of factors. I'm not aware of the full scope of their repair. I think they put out a statement that they think that the damage is isolated in the area where the pavement fell. If that's the case, then it could be fairly quick. So one of the factors that could be the driving force of that timeline could be the repairs to the OPPD's duct bank. And they work pretty fast, so I would suspect to see something that is on the level of weeks as opposed to days or months. And then at the end of all the repairs, and it comes back to the city, and we finish up the final paving, which is a 5 to 7 day process.
Would you be able to give any update on the downtown sinkhole? Any sort of repairs or maintenance that we could see coming to that?
Sure. We have been working with the building owner of the Regis, with a contractor that is working for the building owner. And my understanding as of early this morning is that contractor now has a contract to proceed with some work. I think they're going to start doing some work on the building starting next week. They have a rough timeline that they've given us in the 6 to 8 week range, to where they'll go through and do their repairs. They're going to start systematically with repairs inside the building and move outwards. And so once they're finished with those repairs, then we can finalize that paving as well.
Getting back to the Pacific Street sinkhole, are you confident that there was no damage to the sewer lines?
We didn't have a sewer line that was under the area that was collapsed, not within the collapsed envelope. Yeah.
You mentioned water being on the surface is a possible sign of something's wrong. Are there other kind of more obvious or other signs that people should be aware of? Or
Settlement is a huge indicator. That's a huge indicator.
Coming in down or
Yeah.
ground around it?
Yeah, the pavement coming down around it. In fact, we mentioned the downtown sinkhole at 16th and Farnham. That was, before that collapse, we had that area barricaded off. And the reason we had it barricaded off was we had an indication that there was a problem by the settled pavement. So usually we can find some settlement. Oftentimes we'll see soil that comes out somewhere else downhill or downstream from where it is. That's usually a pretty good indication. If we start seeing soil that doesn't belong there, then we know that there could be a problem that we need to investigate. So very common for us to investigate those.
Is there any chance that this expands, and then with the construction, that you'll have to take out more of the road to fix the whole sinkhole?
We always take out a little bit more of the road. And, one of the very important things on the repair side of it is that we make sure that we find the entire void. Subsurface water can act in very strange ways, to where you can see a void you might not realize, but it could be connected by a small channel to another void. So we want to make sure we find the whole void. We expand the pavement repair to cover the entire void that's occurred. So we're very seasoned in doing those explorations and making sure that we find the extents of those voids.
Are there other voids?
Not to my knowledge at this point in time, but again, there's going to be some excavation. Obviously when something collapses, it's not clean. And so when we do repairs, we make sure we clean up the edges and bring everything up. And so as we start to clean everything out, then we'll start to know if there's a further extent to the void.
Is it safe to say that you're just gonna keep Pacific Street closed until you have the entire street more or less kind of redone, depending on how far you have to go into the other lanes?
I think that's a fair statement. There's a possibility the eastbound lanes could open up a few days sooner, just depending on the nature of the repair and when that gets poured back. But I think my full expectation at this point is that the entire street will remain closed from 66th to 67th.
Do you expect any issues with commute in that area?
Certainly.
If people suspect that they might have a sinkhole and they're seeing some of these indicators, the settlement, the soil moving, who should they talk to?
They can always contact the mayor's hotline. They have staff at the mayor's hotline of 444-5555, very well trained in making sure that those issues get routed to the correct person. I think with sinkhole related matters, because of the interplay between street maintenance and sewer maintenance on that, that's probably the best place to go.